One more thing I'd like to say about poems is that they don't say it all, or quite often they don't. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you take a passage out of, say, Enid Blyton, one of the reasons why Enid Blyton is very popular with children is that she gives you a little plot, something that happens, and then she tells you which side to be on. So if you take a book like Mallory Towers, you'll get some girls being horrible and beastly to each other, then maybe the girls get their own back on the beastly girl, and then Enid Blyton writes, and that served her right. So in a way, she does all the work for the reader, and I think that's quite often why it's so comforting, particularly for inexperienced readers, because unlike, say, Harry Potter, where you keep wondering who's a baddie, who's a goodie, who's a goodie, who's a baddie, and never quite figure it out, which is a bit disconcerting for some young readers, Enid Blyton explains it. Now, poems, quite interesting, because quite often they don't tie the ends up. They might end with a question, or they might put things side by side and you just have to feel why they're side by side. So I think a lot of poems are really interesting because they leave gaps, or they just start in the middle of something. So, you know, the famous Robert Louis Stevenson, faster than, oh, I've forgotten the line, but anyway, it's from a railway carriage. And it just starts faster. That's the first word that you ask. So what's faster? It doesn't tell you. You, in a sense, it's like a guessing game. And so the great thing about a lot of poems is that they're just snatches. They're like photographs in the middle of things, or sometimes they're 2 or 3 photographs and you have to make the connection. So it's almost, instead of spot the difference, it's spot the link. And so that's really, I suppose, it's a way of engaging with children's, I mean, call it philosophical side, really, or if it's not philosophical, it's their kind of intuitive side as well, in which they're having to just feel it. Well, as a lot of education is not about feeling, a lot of education is about getting the right answers and so on. Ideally with poems, we want to open up a world for the children where they can sense that they're not wrong, they can just be right in different ways. So I quite often think that the most important questions you can ever ask children about poems, if you feel like asking them any questions at all, are ones that you don't know the answers to. I think that's absolutely crucial. So we ask them, does it remind you of anything that has ever happened to you? Does it remind you of anything that you've ever read? Or if you could ask anybody or anything in the poem, what would you ask them? And then when you collect up the questions, how would you answer any of those questions? Now, if you approach poems like that, then in a sense what it does, excuse me, is it unlocks those links, if you like. It unlocks them. At home, my parents loved poems, and they used to walk about saying bits out of poems and plays. And singing songs as well, quite a lot of songs. So what sort of poems? Well, they were little, if you might call them street poems, really. So my dad, he used to say a little poem, and it's got 2 words that aren't English in it. Well, 3 actually, now I think about it. And they're in another language called Yiddish that some Jews from Eastern Europe used to speak. And so his little poem went, Herel Schmerel went to the races, lost his gutkers and his braces. Herel means a little chap, Schmerel means a little fool, and your gutkers are either your trousers or your underpants, depending which part of Poland you come from. So I used to listen to this. Herel Schmerel went to the races, lost his gutkers and his braces, and I thought, how did he lose his trousers and his braces? And I thought the only way he could have lost it is by running so fast that they fell down. Many, many years later, I found out that some people, they go to betting shops and they bet all their money, all their house, even down to their trousers on the races. And I think that's what that little poem's about. Herel the little fool, Herel Schmerel went to the races, lost his gutkers and his braces. But all through my childhood, I thought it was because he ran so fast at the races, not at the horse races. So there's another example, but there are many more. My mum was very fond of a poet called W.B. Yeats. And W.B. Yeats is an Irish poet, and some of his poems are quite hard to understand. And she would suddenly come out with a line from one of his poems. And so she might say, tread softly, for you tread on my dreams. And we'll go, what did that mean? Why did she say that? That comes from a poem called Eid Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven, at least I think it is, maybe another one. Or she'd suddenly begin one of his poems, when you are old and grey and nodding by the fire, at least I think that's how it begins. And well, that used to make us scamper off and trying to go and find the poems. Sometimes they were quite hard, but she used to do that. So she used to just come up with the beginning lines of poems. My brother, he liked certain kinds of poems, but his, just trying to think, he used to like pretending to be other people, particularly teachers. So sometimes he was pretending to be the teacher doing the poem, you see, which is slightly different because he was sort of taking the mickey. So he studied a play called Macbeth by William Shakespeare, and in it there's a speech that goes, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day till the last syllable of recorded time. Well, there's quite a funny book called Molesworth which sort of takes the mickey out of that, and the way it does it is by this boy's trying to remember it, and all he can remember is tomorrow. So he goes tomorrow, 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 tomorrow. I can't remember the rest, sir. So my brother, he used to do that quite a lot. I think I write poems in several different ways. One way is to go into a sort of daydreamy thing where I sit there and daydream about things that happened to me, particularly when I was a boy. So I might daydream about sharing my bedroom with my brother. And so what I quite like to do then is after the daydream or in the middle of the daydream to go straight into the middle of the memory. So I'll then go, I share my bedroom with my brother. It's almost as if I'm speaking from inside the daydream. Yes? So if you imagine a daydream's like a bubble, I go into the bubble and then I go, I share my bedroom with my brother, or my brother walks in and he says, so I like to go right to the middle of it. There is a writer called Maurice Gleitzman who said when you write you should always try to start as late as you can. And I think what he meant was that you start in the middle of things, and if you have to go back that doesn't matter, but if you start in the middle it feels much more kind of interesting. I think that's what he thought. So that's one kind of poem. Oh, what poems do I remember? Well, when we were at school we used to do something called choral speaking. That's where we all had to say a poem together. And we did that with a teacher called Mrs. McNabb, who was very, 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 very tall. But she was very nice. And it was a bit like singing in a choir. But instead of singing in a choir, you were saying a poem all together. And I remember we did a poem called The Listeners by Walter de la Mare. Is there anybody there? Said the traveller, knocking on the moonlit door. That was one we did. And another one we did was a poem by a man called Edward Thomas. And that poem is called Addlestrop. And that's all about a station where a train comes in and goes out again. And that begins, yes, I remember Addlestrop. Okay, so that's how that one begins. Those are two that I remember. And then what else? I remember a boy reciting a poem called Autumn Fires. And I think that's by Robert Louis Stevenson. And he sat at the back of the class. He had learnt it off by heart. And every now and then the teacher would say, all right then, William, tell us Autumn Fires. And then he would go, Autumn Fires. And then I think it starts something like all the way up the... Anyway, it's got a little singy bit. And then he'd sing it. And I thought, I wonder why he did that. I couldn't understand that. There's another way, which is where you can imagine things that haven't happened. So I wrote a poem, I'm not even quite sure why I wrote it, but it was about a person staring at a fish and a fish staring at the person. Now, I have never seen anyone staring at a fish. I mean, I did spend a little bit of time looking at a fish in a gallery in the Natural History Museum, and I did think the way the fish was staring, that if you do go on staring at it, it's almost as if you're trying to stare each other out, as we used to try and do when I was at school. But so that's like a third way of writing. It's completely different from the other two, because you're imagining something that never really did happen. Where do I write? That can be anywhere. I quite like writing on buses, because you can get yourself in a bubble. It's quite friendly, there's lots of people around. You're not lonely, because writing can be quite lonely. Or on trains, buses and trains, I like that. Sometimes downstairs in our house, we've got a sort of basementy place, where I'm competing with quite a lot of, back to Lego, quite a lot of the children's Lego. I can write there, and I've also got a den at the end of the garden, and I can write there. And I quite like writing when I'm on holiday, especially after everybody's gone to bed and the house is very, very quiet, apart from the sound of hornets. I think if you feel like writing and you like writing, it sounds really obvious this, but the two best things you can do is to keep writing, and the other thing is to keep reading. Because if you think about it, when you write, you do write with your thoughts and you do write with the things that have happened to you, but actually the moment you start putting the words down, you're actually writing with the words and phrases and sentences and things that you've read. Now, you might be changing them around, so the more you've read, the more interesting ways of writing you'll come up with. So I always say, read and read and read and read, and write and write and write. Don't say, oh, well, tomorrow I'll write. Just scribble something down now. That means probably keeping a notebook or having a bit of paper on you and scribble things down. It doesn't have to be whole poems or whole stories. The most important thing is just to scribble down something that you think sounds interesting. It might be a little bit of a song, or it might be a newspaper headline you saw, or an advert on the bus, or something like that, or something that you heard your mum or your grandmum say, or something like that. Scribble it down and keep it, just as you might keep nice things when you've been to the seaside and you keep seashells. Do the same thing with words and phrases. So write and read. That's kind of obvious, but not in a way, because I do hear people say, oh, I'd so like to be a writer, and I always say, well, what are you writing? And they go, nothing at the moment. And I think, I say, what are you reading? Nothing at the moment. And I think, well, no, you must keep reading, keep writing all the time. If I go into a school, I reckon I can tell within about 30 seconds of me beginning to tell my poems whether this is a school where poems are welcome and the school is familiar with poems, or whether I'm standing in a territory where poems have never really caught on. And I can tell that within about 30 seconds. And sad to say, over the last period of time, there are a lot of schools that the only way they've done poems is according to the strategy, which is in sort of fits and starts. Sort of strange kind of way of you just sort of do a unit. And I always think the word poetry and unit don't really go together very well. Maybe one day I'll write a poem about unit. But anyway, and I've found that that's a very dry, squashed way of doing poetry. The best thing you can do with poems is to just have them about. You don't even really have to teach them. You just live with them and have them around on the walls, on CDs, on DVDs, and just constantly keep poetry going along in a school. Ideal for assemblies, ideal for the end of the day. You've got 30 seconds. Instead of telling the children to sit there with their hands on their heads, just read a poem. Get the children to bring poems in, get the parents to bring in poems. So you just make poems part of the air, because these are very accessible and important ways of using language. So that's one of the first things I notice. I've also noticed that children are very flexible about genre. We somehow, because we tend to teach in genres, now we're doing story, now we're doing poem, actually when you get in there and if you tell a story and pop a poem in, or if you're doing a poem and you pop a story in, children aren't bothered. They don't think, oh my goodness, he swapped genres. So, you know, we have to think very flexibly about the way in which we think of these things. So when I do my performances, I mix a combination of poems, singing, storytelling, joke telling, and I mix it all up because I think it's quite important to see that poetry belongs in a lot of frameworks. It's the sister, brother and sister of a lot of genres. It doesn't simply exist on its own. Quite often, I think in the past, we thought of poetry as this sort of, I don't know, some kind of special category that we have to think of as separate. But I'm quite keen for the barriers to come down. I was doing some poems with the class today. we were being a rocket. They're doing a project on space, and they're going to the Science Museum, and they'll be looking at Apollo. They've been looking at Apollo and this sort of thing. And what was nice was that as we started talking, the children were doing all sorts of gestures and things. You know, one boy said, "I'm a rocket," and I go, "Zoom, zoom, zoom." And I immediately picked up and I thought, that's great. We've got a sort of chorus there. We could all go zoom, zoom, zoom. And, you know, if you build that in and you can talk about it, because sometimes, especially particularly if children have just written a poem, that they're quite nervous and confined. So you've got to find ways in which the poem can sort of leap off the page. And some of it can come if you construct a poem orally. One of the simplest ways of constructing a poem is to find a chorus. And a chorus could be as simple as you like. It could be knife and fork. So there you go. You say, well, we're going to do a poem about food we like. So you've got a little chorus that goes knife and fork. So then you get half the class going knife and fork, knife and fork, knife and fork. That's what the musicians would call a bed. Okay, you've got a musical bed there, knife and fork, knife and fork. And then people say, I like pizza, knife and fork, knife and fork. You could switch the chorus and go, I don't know, it's tea time, knife and fork, knife and fork. I like chicken curry, knife and fork, tea time. You see, and you do it orally, and then suddenly, if you've got something, all right, that's just about eating things, but if it's something with a bit of action in, the children will immediately put actions in to their bodies, and that way poems come alive. I think you connect poems with performance. You connect poems with the idea that they live around on the walls. And I think you have to have a poetry corner, really, in your classroom. And just see what happens, build it up. I was talking to a teacher the other day, and she said she put a mirror in the poetry corner. And I said, why is that? She said, well, the children asked for it. And I said, why? She said, because when they performed the poems, they wanted to know what they looked like. And then she noticed that the children went down there, and when they read the poem, they looked in the mirror. So they were going down behind the dustbin, like that. And I thought, isn't that brilliant? A mirror in the poetry. I'd no more thought of that than Fly Over the Moon. I thought, what a great idea. But also, of course, whatever is your AV systems, you want CDs, DVDs, access to the internet or whatever. There are wonderful resources on the internet now for poems. There's the National Poetry Archive, there are authors' websites. There's many, many ways. It's on YouTube, there's all sorts of poets and reading their own poems and other people's poems and so on. So you want to give children access to all that as well. The very simplest, most obvious thing to do is to put poems up on the walls of your classroom and then to take them down and put up new ones. I think when I go into classrooms, I'm amazed at how few do you ever see a poem on the wall. And all you've got to do is just take a great big sheet of sugar paper and write out a poem. Stick it up on the wall, and you don't have to say anything about it. Probably the children are going to start asking you questions, and one of the best answers is, I don't know. So if the children say, why have you put it up? You say, I don't really know. Why do you think? And if they say, you know, where does it come from? You say, well, I don't know, I found it in a book. Be a bit mysterious about it. And then just put it up, and then maybe, you know, if you've got a well-organised classroom, you could have post-its next to the poem. And then anything that anybody thinks about the poem, or about any bit of the poem, they could write on the post-it and stick it up next to the poem. So the idea that a poem is a way of beginning a conversation. If ever I think about why poets write, the only answer I can ever come up with is to see what happens. That's the only thing. I mean, maybe other poets have come up with some other answer to that question, but that's all it is really. They're like throwing something out to see the way in which other human beings will respond. So in a way, if teachers think like that, think of poems as things just that are there to see what happens. They're not teaching tools, they're not some little lesson plan. All they are things that you put out there to see what happens to people's imaginations and minds and memories and so on. So bung a poem up on the wall, just see what happens. I think when you write poems, one of the key things that you're trying to do is taking things that are very everyday and familiar and trying to, as it were, put a new twist on it. I mean, one way is to call it fresh. Another way, makes it quite dense as a little phrase, is to make the familiar unfamiliar. So there's somewhere or another that you just alter the way you look at the world. Now, a lot of fiction doesn't do that. A lot of fiction is about, if you like, rather than making it unfamiliar, a lot of fiction is more about explaining and taking the reader by the hand through a landscape that, in a sense, the child is quite familiar with. Not all of it, because some of it is fantasy and so on. But I think poetry, quite often it does that. Not all the time, but quite often it does that. And I think that's quite a good idea, because if you just accept the world as it is, then you'll never think that you can change anything or anything will ever change. And the thing about poetry is that it seems to do a thing where it alerts the child or the adult to the idea that the world is changeable, and you can view it in a changing way, or the world can change. And I think we need that. And then there's another way, which is the playful area, is that if you think about children when they come into school, they own a language, perhaps 2 languages, and they own that, and that's theirs. Then they arrive at school, and then through a set of procedures called learning to read, learning to write, if you think what it must feel like as a 4 and 5, 6, 7-year-old, is that it must really feel as if you don't own language anymore. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to these incredibly clever, all big people, teachers, assistant teachers, whoever. They all own that stuff. And books, which are all perfect and neat and don't make mistakes. But when I try to do it, it's a mess, or I can't unlock it off the page, or teachers talk sometimes and I don't understand what they're saying. And there's all sorts of words and stuff up on the wall. There's rules, and we will walk quietly, and we will be gentle with each other, and all that stuff. And it kind of doesn't belong to you, any of that stuff. If the children are writing poetry, or if they're finding a way to take possession of the poems that are in the books, then this is one way in which children can really sense that it's not only the oral world they can possess, but the written world as well. One of the ways of doing that is through play, through the play with language. If you realise you could play, you know, if you've got 2, 3 and 4-year-olds, if you just say table Mabel, they'll suddenly run with it and go table Mabel, table fable, Grable Babel, and they'll play with it. The older children sometimes a bit more inhibited about that, but somehow poetry makes it legitimate. Just as I was coming here, I was thinking I'd like to write a book of poems which are all written from the point of view of objects and things, and I suddenly thought, well, it could be like the song of the this, or it could be the dream of this. And I was thinking you could have the song of the nose, and the song of the nose would be something like sniff, sniff, sneeze, sneeze, whiff, whiff. Do you see what I mean? I suddenly thought that would be one of those where the child would be able to read it and immediately possess it, and then perhaps run with it and make up another song of the nose or a song of the eyes or whatever. And so that's one way in which children can possess the written language. I think we're too hung up on the idea that the way the child possesses language is if we teach them sentences. Language is much more than sentences. It's about whole cadences, whole ideas that run across paragraphs, run across poems, run across chapters and books and so on. And we want children to get hold of that stuff. Poetry enables you to do it in one gulp. You know, poems, you can grab the whole thing in a sense. So I think that's another thing that makes it very, very important. Another important area with poetry is that if you think about it, the moment a poet or a poem is talking about how you live, the poem is really a carrier of culture. So let's say you're going to talk about a meal you've had. Well, we think of food as a very cultural thing to do. It marks out who we are, what kind of foods we like, what kind of foods. The moment you start talking about grandparents, then you're talking about the culture or cultures that are yours. Well, this is very important for children establishing who they are. If we just think of schools simply as models of some kind of place where instruction goes on, then we're missing the point. A lot of what education has to be about is for children to explore some part of themselves, to think about who they are, because you can't learn in this very abstract way as if you're just somehow a sheet of paper and instruction is just written on the piece of paper. You have to find out what kind of a person you are who is doing the learning. And one of the best ways of doing that is to explore aspects of your culture. And a poem is a perfect way to do it. You only have to talk about going over to your grandparents and what you do and what you eat, and suddenly you're exploring aspects of your culture. If you talk about where you've moved from to in your life, it might be from down the road or it might be from another country. Or if you're going to look at something even as apparently trivial as how you do your hair, all these things are about exploring your identity. If you take names, there's a nice way to do oral poetry as well. You take your name, you go and find out from your mums and dads and grandparents why you've got these two names and what do they mean, and then you make a chorus out of your own name. So if you say Michael Rosen, that would be the chorus. And then you say, well, where does the Michael come? Michael comes from a friend of my parents. Michael Rosen. Rosen comes from, and on you go like that. And you can just make a poem, and then you're exploring some aspect of your identity, your culture. Poems do that all the time, just simply by talking about themselves. That's what poets do. And another area is that, we think in quite a lot of schools that circle time is quite important. Circle time, we want children to express something about themselves that matters, something that's happened to them that is concerning them. A poem is a perfect space in which you can put those concerns. And I'm always a bit disconcerted that sometimes these circle times start from what is really quite an abstract sort of a question, like bullying or bereavement. But really, poems, quite often, it doesn't have to be poems, they could be short stories or myths and things like that, that they're actually very concrete ways of getting into some of those things. So let's say you were thinking, well, it'd be a good idea to talk about sympathy and compassion. Well, if you take some of the Greek myths, sometimes the gods express sympathy with these people going through these terrible things on earth, and sometimes they don't seem to give a damn. Well, you could pick a Greek myth where someone is expressing sympathy for someone who's going through something awful, and then you could sit there and talk about it off the back of that, and then write a poem off the back of that. Because sometimes one of the other nice things about poems is you don't have to write it so it's I. You could be the god who's expressing the pity, or the human being who's wishing that they had the pity, and then you could write it. So if you take, say, classic father and son problem, like Daedalus and Icarus, all right, well, there's a father-son thing where the son doesn't listen to what his dad says. Well, let's say something's cropped up where parents are worried about their children not listening, and that comes up in circle time. There's a perfect story, and then all you've got to do is write the poem from the point of view of either Daedalus or Icarus, or both. You make it so it's a conversation or whatever, and then you're into something that's really quite deep and profound that affects every child. When their mums or dads say to them, go to bed, do they go? Well, it's a bit the same. Do you carry on flying to the sun or not? But you don't have to write about it about bedtime. You can write about it from the point of view of Daedalus and Icarus. And that way, poetry can unlock some of these very deep feelings, sometimes not by saying I, meaning you, but I, meaning somebody else.